Welcome to Lead Pods, the official leadership podcast from USMB for pastors and church leaders, where our goal is to increase our impact together.
Hello, my friends. Welcome to episode 72 of the USMB Lead Pods. My name is Matt Ersman, and I'll be your host today, and I'm excited to share another really great conversation with you. And please rest assured, this is really me. I'm not a robot. This isn't an AI-generated script. We're all back to 100% humans this week. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I encourage you to listen to last week's episode where we talked all about ChatGPT and all the crazy AI stuff going on. But anyway, today I'm grateful to have Brian Harris back on with us. As many of you might know or might remember, he's the relatively new church planting mobilizer with USMB. He's got a big heart for planting churches all across the country. He's got a lot of great experience to help our denomination kind of grow in that area. So we had Brian on, I think back in August when he had just started in this new position. And now that he's a few months in, we thought it'd be good to have him back to share some updates on as he's been traveling around, meeting pastors, and kind of got a few months under his belt in this position now. What's the latest? What's new with USMB church planting efforts? How can we work together to plant some new churches? And we even talk about, are new churches even necessary? Do we need to keep planting a whole bunch of more churches? And I think some of the stats and the stories that Brian shares today might surprise you. The need that's still out there for more and more churches, even in places that you might not expect. Brian's a great guy. I always enjoy talking to him, and I appreciate his heart for ministry and for church planting especially. I think you will as well. So let's take a quick break to hear from a sponsor, and then we'll get all the latest updates on USMB church planting from Brian Harris.
USMB invites you to register for Vocation, a free webinar series beginning Tuesday, February 28th. Whether you are a church leader navigating division and weariness or a church member feeling hurt and vulnerable to shame, this series is for you. Vocation will include webinars on February 28th and March 14th, and 2 weeks of personal reflection as Amelia Banks of Penny and Sparrow Therapy and Ben Connolly of the Equipping Group help us find deep refreshment in our truest calling. For more information or to register, visit usmb.org. Join us for Vocation as we learn to embrace our stories and lean into our calling.
All right, my friends. So today I'm excited to bring back a friend of the show who was on last August, which it seems like it's kind of hard to believe it's been that long already. But Brian Harris is joining us today. Brian is the relatively new church planting mobilizer for USMB. He started last summer, and we're going to have him on today just to kind of give an update for what he's doing and what he's seeing as he travels around the country working with church planting. So Brian, welcome back to the show. Glad to have you with us.
Well, thanks for having me back. Yeah, it seems like 6 months has been the longest curve in my journey so far of learning, but it's been a good one.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, we're so grateful to have you back. And yeah, you've covered a lot of ground in 6 months. I'm excited to hear an update from you. So if people want to listen, if they missed the first episode, again, I think you were on with us last August, but if people didn't listen, can you just give a refresher, remind us who you are, where you came from, what this whole new role is about, and what some of your goals are? Love just to hear some of that, just kind of a brief intro here.
Sure. So I was out in Western Oklahoma. I am now outside of Tulsa, but I was out in Western Oklahoma, Weatherford at Pine Acres Church, an MB church out there. Got there in 2004. So I was almost 20 years pastoring out there. During that time, I was on the church planting for the Southern District, which is called CEEC, C-E-E-C. And working with churches. I partly joined that because of my appreciation prior to this planting my own church in Ohio. And so when I moved to Oklahoma, I really wanted to kind of pay it back because church planters owe so much to the churches that support. So I wanted to do that. And so I was involved for quite a while. Over the last couple of years, the U.S. conference made a shift towards what was called the Church Planting Council. And I also volunteered onto that board. But one of the first things that the board wanted to do was hire a church planting mobilizer. And I didn't even think about it at the time. I was waiting for Ed Stetzer or somebody to walk in and take the position. And after about 6 months of us looking at this position, I felt compelled to at least put my name in there and say, hey, I don't know, that would be great, but I really have a heart for what we're talking about here. And so the church planting council visited, called me on, and started back in August. So we left, it's 3 hours drive from Weatherford to Owasso. One of the reasons was wanted to be near some MB churches. There's 2 in this area, plus it's really close to an airport. And since last time I was on, I wasn't much of a flyer. Now I am a frequent flyer. And so I
Nice.
fly out of Tulsa a ton.
Rack up those miles, man. Rack up those miles.
I have. Yes.
Awesome. So as the mobilizer, again, like we know that word, but it's also a little hazy. So what is it? What is it? Can you explain again, just briefly, what is the church planting mobilizer? What's your role? What are some of your goals? Kind of explain what that is again.
So as a mobilizer, I'm the one who spends full time thinking about how we can be, as a U.S. conference, involved in church planting. And that role includes building relationships with pastors and churches. So my goal is to get all of these churches collectively together working towards the grander goal of planting. It's really hard for an individual church to plant a church. It takes a lot of effort and work. In fact, there's a Harvard Business article, and it said even secular companies now are starting to partner with each other to come out with brand new products because it's so difficult at times.
Oh, yeah.
And churches, planting churches together makes it a little bit. So what I try to do is collect churches together into what I'm calling missional networks. And in these little missional networks of 5 to 10 churches, we talk through a plan that's including looking at locations, raising funds. And there's a myriad of ways that a church can be involved in planting a daughter church. And that's really what I'm trying to do, is stir that up.
Okay. Awesome. Very cool. So yeah, so it's kind of funny. Last time we talked, you were just, I think, weeks into your role. It was kind of brand new. And you were obviously still figuring things out, especially since it's a new position. There's a lot of newness going on. So why don't you catch us up? So since August, where all have you gone? How are things going? What are you seeing so far?
Yeah, it was a very big curve, like I said earlier, to get on board. And so one of the first things was just meeting people. Being in the Southern District, I was familiar with almost all the guys in Oklahoma, many of the guys in Kansas, but much outside that circle, I didn't know as many. And so really what I did in August was I would sit down and listen to sermons from all the pastors across the conference, dozens and dozens and dozens of sermons. Then I'd send a little card out and just say, hey, thanks. Because I tell you, we have some amazing, gifted communicators and shepherds in our conference. Because I needed to introduce myself. I just didn't want to fly into town one day and say, hi, I'm on your front doorstep and I want to introduce. So we built some connections, and that was what I was doing in the early season. And then we started making Zoom contact with different pastors and church leaders. And then finally in October and November was really when I started making trips to see different places. And so August and September, early October was mostly Zoom and letters. Starting in October, November, so visiting Ohio for a lot of our Congolese churches. Spent some time up there with Henry and Gono and that group. Went down to the Lamb Conference and met with all the pastors down there, the Rio Grande Valley area. Made a nice little trip out to Utah, visited our church plants out in Utah.
Yeah.
Did a Central California tour, traveled through from Fresno to San Jose to Sacramento and back all in about a 3-day window.
Oh, wow. Whirlwind. Okay.
It was a whirlwind. And so a lot of those types of trips, I've got still some more to go. I wanted to get up to the Northwest, Oregon, Washington area. In March, I'm going to be making a trip up to Omaha, Nebraska, South Dakota. So just slowly chipping away, getting to see on site all the churches.
Yeah, good. And you mentioned there you're visiting both established churches as well as some kind of newer plants. So right now you're kind of just getting to know everybody, kind of figuring out the lay of the land, maybe where some opportunities are lying. As you're beginning this travel, what are some of your takeaways? Are you seeing there's some spots that you're excited, like, oh yeah, this is clearly a spot where it'd be really great to plant? Or are you still just kind of like, oh yeah, here's this guy would be great to work with this person? Or what are some of your kind of initial thoughts as you've been doing this traveling?
Well, right now it's all very tentative. We're getting data, and that's kind of the collection of data. So we're slowly beginning to develop these networks. So I'll give you like the Kansas network would be one example. 5 or 10 churches, central eastern Kansas, working together. And so that group has to pray through where, when, how, who, those kinds of questions on what they want to do. So my job really isn't as a top down as much as a facilitator, a mobilizer. I like to call myself a holy annoyance. That's my nickname I've given myself.
Nice.
Because A holy annoyance is somebody who comes along and you all want to do this, but you get busy and things get kind of crazy. And I'm here just to keep poking at this thing going forward.
Yeah.
And so each of the networks, we're beginning now to search out those two elements, the people that are going to plant and the places we want to plant.
Yeah.
And so that's where the data is being dredged up.
Yeah. Cool. Very cool. And one thing I want to hear about, so I was talking with a MB pastor a few weeks ago, and he lives in a kind of a smaller community. He says, I don't know any population numbers or anything like that, but he said for their small town, they've got a handful of churches. And he asked, he's like, in my community, we don't really need another church. So what does church planning look like for someone like me, who's a leader, Christian pastor, MB leader in a small community where we're kind of saturated with churches? So if they want to plant, what could they do? What's kind of the next step? I'm sure that's one of the things you're working on.
Yeah. And that comes up rather frequently. If you look at the statistics, though, the need is massive. So I'll start with South Dakota. There are 66 counties in South Dakota. Of those 66 counties, 42 have less than 10% of an evangelical Protestant population.
Wow.
So now there are some counties that are up to maybe half, but very few are more than 50%. So there's always still, so if a community has 10,000 people in it, there will very rarely be a community that has more than 5,000.
Okay.
The two states in the United States that have the highest evangelical population are my state here in Oklahoma, which is at 41%, and Alabama, 42%. Okay. That's the highest. It begins to drop dramatically from there. So the need is huge. If you just take Oregon, California, and Washington, there is no county, 0 counties in all that has more than a 20% evangelical population.
Wow.
So the need's huge here. Yeah. It just seems like, well, there's people, they're religious, but they're not going to church. And the statistics are starting to bear that out heavily.
And I wanted to bring this up at some point. You send out the email newsletter called The Field, so we can maybe talk about that a little bit. But you sent one out not too long ago where you shared some stats about Kansas. I'm in Kansas. I live in Kansas. I think most people would say, you would guess that Kansas would be a highly churched state, but you had some pretty surprising stats about Kansas even. Can you share those?
Yeah, it was shocking to look at Kansas because being right on the border of Oklahoma, which I still think 41% evangelicals is fairly low, but 18% was what Kansas landed.
Crazy.
There are certain counties, particularly Russell County, right in the center of the state, 5% evangelical population. And so as you travel around, and there are a lot of MB churches in Kansas, and so there's real potential to work in areas that may be lacking a church. In fact, there is a conference coming up. It's actually sponsored by the Southern Baptists on rural church planting. That I would love to have some guys go out and look at that because we are primarily a denomination that has rural churches. And so we need to start to crack that code of how to plant churches in rural areas because we're pretty knowledgeable about our own communities. I was over in Weatherford. Weatherford's just a small community, but the need is great in Weatherford, but it's also great all across the country.
Yeah. So I guess I'm kind of curious. I don't know if you have research or just for your experience or whatever, but so for example, from Wichita, I live in Wichita, I work in Wichita, Ridgepoint Church within, I don't know, 200 yards, there's 4 churches. And within a couple miles, there's probably a dozen churches. So I guess I'd like to hear you just talk about, do we just need more? Or when you see and you read those stats, is there a bigger problem, or do we need to kind of have more kind of niche churches that are reaching people that if a community already has a bunch of churches, how can we reach the people who aren't coming?
Right. And so when you look at it, 100 years ago, there were about 25 churches for every 10,000 people. Now it's down to about 10. So about one church for every 1,000 people. It's really dropped in those numbers. Well, the population has grown. The churches haven't necessarily. But when I look at those numbers and I'm measuring this off of the evangelical church population, because the mainline denominations have been dying off. Almost every one of those mainline denominations have gone cut in half in the last 50 years. And so as those churches die, we're having a lot of religious people who float around, but they're not connected anywhere.
Okay.
And so if we were to look at Sedgwick County, right? That's where, which the Sedgwick County, it would have about one out of 4 people possibly in an evangelical church. And when you look at those kinds of numbers, those get real large, because a county the size of Sedgwick County, well, here it is. I'm looking at the numbers now. It's 1 out of 5, 20% are in an evangelical Protestant church. Sedgwick County has 524,000 people.
Yeah.
400,000 of them are not in an evangelical church.
Yep. Yeah.
So even though there are churches around, about 100,000, a little more than that, 120,000 are in it, and 400,000 are. So 1 out of every 5 people.
Yep.
Then the next question is, of those churches, there's a statistic that shows between 65 and 80% of those churches are either plateaued or declining, meaning in the future, they're not going to be adding to their congregations. They're in the stages of some level of dying.
Yeah.
And that's where church plants, when they come into the picture, begin to reach in. It's almost like a new network of people. So when we planted our church in the suburbs of Cleveland, we built a whole new network with relationships, because we were new to the community, found new people, and they may have had church background in the past, but they were disconnected. But because we came into that community, we were finding people who weren't going. And when you have possibly a third of the evangelical churches actually focused on outreach, you're talking about a very small portion that are reaching that 400,000 in Sedgwick County, for an example.
Yeah. 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 That's crazy. Yeah. Those numbers are just mind boggling, right? Because especially for the communities that you kind of assume would be higher Christian, it's crazy, just the need that's out there.
Well, the reason I see this, so I could take my little town that I grew up in, town of about 5,000 in Ohio. I grew up in a mainline denomination that did not preach the gospel. I had asked for years how to get to heaven. Nobody knew. In that, it wasn't like a East Coast or West Coast town. It was a little community, in a farming community in Ohio.
Yeah.
And when I got saved in high school, I literally went back to school that Monday, and I did not know if I knew anybody who was a Christian. And so what I think happens is, a lot of times we who are believers, we find friendships and connections, and we say, well, I've got all my Christian friends. Obviously, there are a lot of Christians out there.
Yeah.
But I was in my own little bubble, who I didn't know those people. And then the Christians sometimes can get into that bubble, and those two worlds never, ever intersect.
Yep. Yeah. Well, let's talk about that for a minute. So I know one of the things that people talk about with church plants is kind of, instead of kind of trying to grow an existing church plants tend to bring an energy and excitement. There's maybe a kind of a certain personality type that might be drawn to something that's new instead of something that's existing. So can you talk about that a little bit? Like, how can church plants kind of help meet some of those needs?
Right. And the numbers are out there where if you're starting a church, your entire focus is on that evangelism. And it tends to happen. Almost all churches will go through a curve in a church plant where they will focus on evangelism. And if they're not careful, they can allow that to kind of diminish.
Yeah. Right.
So in those first couple of years is when it really has a strong takeoff point. That's what happens with the church plant. Now, if they continue on that trajectory, they're going to have a much more evangelistic spirit. Whereas an established church, there's a lot more going on. You're having to develop programming and building campaigns, and and all of those are good, but sometimes they take emphasis away from evangelism, and everything tends to plateau. And so church plants keep pushing that. Now, I think what's great about it is a both and approach. So you don't say to an established church, you're done.
Yeah, right.
We're going to put all our eggs in the church planting basket. You say, we're going to keep planting churches to keep reaching out, which reinvigorates the local church to say, hey, we need to be doing the same thing. In
Yep.
fact, I think of all of our networks, we base it off of Acts 1:8, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, utter ends of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
But we've got to start, and all the pastors who are in the network have to say, well, how am I doing at personal evangelism? Because it starts with that.
Right.
It starts here in my seat. I'm not sharing my faith. But then it goes out in those concentric circles going out. And as we continue those circles out, we get involved in church planting, both local, the Samaria, which would be like the Congolese churches with Henry is doing, Henry Lolo, and then with how we partner with Multiply even. So even in our networks, I do not try to lock it in on just simply traditional church planting. I want to see it as a part of this 4-stage Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, ends of the earth.
Yeah, that's really good. Okay, so let's go back to if a pastor or church leader is listening. Man, the longer I work at a church, like church work is very hard. It never stops. And people kind of ask me, when's your kind of down season? When are you a little less busy? And 10 years in, I haven't found one. Like if you're working at church, it really doesn't matter if you're a big church, small church, you're busy. There's a billion things going on all the time. So let's say someone listening, maybe they haven't planted a church or it's been a long time. They love what you're saying. They believe in the mission. Obviously evangelism is important to them. They want to plant, but maybe they don't have enough resources. Their staff is at the max already. They want to get involved, and maybe they're probably financially supporting, Multiply or USMB or whatever, but they want to take the next step. But if maybe it feels like they can't do it on their own, that's part of what you're doing, I know. So what's kind of the next step for someone in that situation?
Perfect. That was a nice little softball to throw up, because I'll give you an example.
Perfect.
In March, I'm going to be going up to see Daniel Rodriguez up in Omaha.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to collect together a group of guys from the Nebraska region and talk as a collective group. What does it look like? And so that would be an opportunity to start another missional network. So we've got one in Oklahoma. We've got one in Kansas. Looking at starting this next one in Nebraska. So pastors and church leaders who want to be a part of this would say, okay, we're going to get together on a consistent basis. I try to do this monthly. And what we do is there's 3 elements to it. It's biblical. So we have to stay on scripture.
Yeah.
It's missional. We've got to be reaching out into the community, thinking Acts 1:8, and it's got to be relational. A lot of times we'll get together, but if we're not on mission, it falls apart. I'm reading a book. I got to read this quote because this one, it just explains exactly what the network is supposed to do.
Okay.
This book says, when relationship is the sole purpose of getting together, the network quickly falls apart. Relationship without mission, entropy sets in. And mission without relationship, entropy sets in. But if you put these things together, you get sustainability. And so what the network is to do is have people connecting in relationship, but with a purpose. And that purpose is to say, how do we advance the kingdom? And so these guys would get together monthly to visit, talk through the potential of people and the places. And so it's almost a laboratory. If you think about it, it's not a done deal. We're going to get together. We're going to talk. What's our next obstacle? What do we not need to knock out of the way to get to this next goal? And so the leadership of that really comes from within the network itself on how do we do that? So if there was a person that says, I want to get involved in church planting, but either we don't have a lot of resources or we're limited, I would say partner with a network. And we've got my goal is to see 10 networks launched. And so that's where everyone has a group. So what's the benefit of the network? Well, for a church planter, it's going to be huge because imagine the baby shower that you typically hear about. And this young family, they've got needs and they don't have all the supplies for this child that's going to be coming into the home soon. But a group of people get together and they throw this baby shower. A church planting network is a little bit like a group that hosts the baby shower. because they're there to support them, both helping them with finances, but really a lot of it is relationship, connections, support and training, support in emotion, because it's a hard, difficult road to hoe. You need people to talk into you saying, you can do this, you can do this. And so it has benefit on both sides. It helps the churches become more Antioch oriented, Acts 11 and 13. It also helps the church planner know that there is not just a line item in a budget, but actually a group of people who care about them, who are praying for them. That's where the networks have the most bang.
Yeah. No, that's great. I think it's so smart to do it in that way because, it takes a lot of people to pull off a church plan, doesn't it? A lot of people.
It does.
And a couple of times now you've kind of mentioned the big things to figure out, obviously, are people in place, right? You need the right people in the right place for something like this to really work. And I know, like for USMB, some of our kind of core initiatives right now are both church planning and leadership development, right? So obviously, for church plan to work, you need a good leader. You need a gifted speaker, someone who can rally everybody, all that. And those people are rare, right? It's hard to find those kinds of people. And I know we're in a season where we're really trying to hone in on leadership development, finding those potential church planners out there. I know they're doing a lot with the leadership pipeline, and there's a lot of things kind of in progress for that. Can you talk about that a little bit? Like, how can we be on the lookout for church planners and future leaders, or anything you want to share? And again, I want to mention your email again, the field email. You mentioned Bill Walsh, but I think his example might fit in here. So talk about that a little bit.
Right. So, and here is a bit of an apology to all my people that I've worked with over the years, because I think there's two tracks that you can go on. When you think of Bill Walsh, the head coach for the 49ers back in the 80s, he won 3 Super Bowls, had an amazing career. And so you could say, wow, that was an amazing thing. Very few people have that kind of success in coaching. Now, he has not been in coaching for over 30 years. He passed away about 15 years ago, but he still leaves his fingerprint on the NFL today because he was a coach who developed coaches. And now if you look across the NFL, about half the coaches that are in are his disciples, either second generation. You got your Mike Holmgrens and your Andy Reeds who helped build that. But there's these guys who he trained, who trained others, and it kept going. It's the Paul, Timothy, faithful people, that journey. And so using the Bill Walsh picture, I could look at myself as a pastor and say, I want to be successful like Bill Walsh and have 3 Super Bowl championships, which would mean I want to be known as a great preacher. I want to have a nice facility. I want to have a great budget. Or I could turn that and say, I want to leave a legacy. Now, the leaving a legacy would be, I'm going to look for over my ministry to find people who I can invest in, who will be the next church plant, next pastor, next missionary. And so I have a desire. What if when I'm gone, there are 20 men who I was able to disciple who are pastoring in 20 different churches and planting churches well after I'm not here. And so if we backtrack from that and say, okay, that's what we want, thinking as like Stephen Covey, think with the end in mind, let's come back to today and say, okay, then that means I'm going to have to carve out time and look for people to develop. And so, with Kyle and Goins and the leadership development pipeline, all of that is so integral. It would be the equivalent of being a college football coach and saying, well, we didn't recruit anybody for the last 10 years and we're going to put a national championship team together next year. Well, you're not.
Right.
And so what has to happen is we have to begin cultivating and saying to each pastor, will you find your Timothy? And so one of the tasks in the networks are, and this is where there's a little bit of accountability built into this. Each pastor who's involved in the network is also responsible to say, I'm going to prayerfully look for God to bring 1, 2, maybe 3 men who I can train and develop and disciple to go into ministry.
Yeah.
And so with that, you have the potential for this group of pastors. In the past, a lot of it is, I could put it this way. You're either going to buy your church planters or you're going to build them. And we don't want to buy them. Buying them means we look around at the seminaries all around the country and just grab them and bring them in.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's not a horrible thing to do that. We can do both, but if we set our focus on building the men and women in our churches, developing them,
Yeah.
that's the long haul. It's not quick, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not going to produce something tomorrow because you're having to build that over the long haul. But then you have a base. And so these are the conversations we're having. So we want to do both. We want to find people who are hot and ready to go now. And we have a
Mm-hmm.
handful of those who are there.
Yep.
Can't put all of our eggs in that basket.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess we got a lot of things we could hit. Our time's already kind of running short here, Brian, but when we're on there, because I think that's so important. So if someone listening does have someone kind of in mind, maybe a church planter, or maybe just a future leader, what are some things that you'd recommend for kind of next steps? How do we start to have that mindset and start to develop those leaders around us?
So one of the things that a person could do is say, I'm going to pick up because there's so much great material on discipleship.
Yeah.
But discipleship that has how to be a disciple maker who makes disciples. And so it can't be simply, the shift has to be from me giving information to somebody and then it stops with them.
Yeah.
What you're looking for is praying for, God, give me somebody who I can invest in, who is committed to investing in somebody else. So 2 Timothy 2:2, it just carries that pathway out. And so the materials that are out there today are more than we've ever had on how to do some discipling. So there is in the newsletter, I've got a couple of books and articles that people can access for a disciple making handbook is available for some folks to pick up materials. One of the easiest ways is just to say, I'm going to study the Gospels with somebody and walk through the harmony of the Gospels.
Yeah, good. I like that. I think we all, no matter our age, our position, right, we should always be doing that. I think that's a good DNA that we should all work on growing ourselves and in our churches. I love that perspective. Okay, well, one of my last questions, we'll start to wrap up here. So again, I kind of mentioned a minute ago, church life is just busy, it's hectic. And I know for church leaders, especially if it's a church plant or a young church, they might kind of look around them and feel pressure like, oh, we're a smaller church plant. We can't live stream yet, or we don't have a really great worship leader. Our kids ministry is just a couple kids. We want to make it better, but so if someone is either they've already planted and maybe they're kind of feeling some of those things, or maybe some of those thoughts are keeping people from planting, what would you say if you're going to plant a church now, 2023, what are the priorities? Where do you start when there's so much that you could do? There's some pressure to do a lot of these things really well right off the bat. How can you start to set yourself up to be a successful church plant?
The biggest issue here is going to be giving up and measuring things by, not quitting, but
Sure.
control. So we've measured so much on seating capacity. The Antioch church in Acts measured on sending capacity. So it mentions in Acts 13, there were 5 leaders. Barnabas and Saul were set apart and sent out. So of those 5, 22 of them, 40%, almost half their leadership team left to go on mission. And they had to give up. And so I think it's not to tell a church that it will be pain free,
right?
That it will be, because it's going to be painful. And that's part of the reason why we don't do it, because we already have holes in our own ministry. How can we possibly send somebody out when we have so many needs here? And so that tension pours in. And so I would say the network, pulling people together in groups so that the sacrifice is shared across a larger body than just a single individual congregation, is one of the things that would help. But then when those 5 or 10 churches say, we want to do this together, and they say, it's going to be painful, but we're all going to be in pain together. But just like a mom, I can't personally make claims on this, but when a mom gives birth, that's obviously painful. But any mom who's had a second child obviously said, hey, it was worth it to have another. So there's obvious pain. And we would not be in church planting saying that there is no pain, but the joy on the flip side of that is to look back and say, we've left a legacy. And so The only way I could mitigate that is to say it's a lot of fun to be in partnership with a bunch of other guys and gals who are saying we want to do the same thing together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. Again, it's so important. Okay, one of the last things we haven't hit yet. So we talked a lot about this last little bit about the people. The place thing I think is interesting because that's obviously one of the hardest parts to figure out. Like, where are you going to meet? And before that, even what city are we going to meet in? And how are we going to figure all that out? Are we going to rent a space for a while, meet in a school, build a building? You want to talk anything about place, maybe specifically for like figuring out the building side of things, but also like you kind of mentioned, the Pacific Northwest is in desperate need of some more churches. So how do you even start with figuring out where you're going to plant? Can you talk about that a little bit?
It's interesting because you could almost put a blindfold on, take a map, put a pin in it, it would be a fine spot to plant.
Yeah,
because the statistics are so huge against evangelical churches. So from there, the next step is for these networks to begin looking and say, what's strategic for us? So let's say there's a dozen churches that are working together and they notice certain locations that have very low church attendance.
Mm-hmm.
They're within a proximity to be able to maybe shive off some people. It used to be in the old days. When I planted, ours was a parachute drop, meaning we left far enough away that we went there by ourselves, dropped in and started from borderline scratch, met people and pulled them in. That's probably not the best model anymore because it's much more difficult. Rather than saying we might be able to hive off, go a shorter distance to still a needy area where there's new churches and work together. And so that's what these networks, once the data starts to show up, you start looking at, okay, in this case of Kansas, if Russell, Kansas has 5% evangelical, that seems like a reasonable spot to look at.
Yeah.
And then take little field trips. And so one of the projects that'll be coming around the corner with a lot of our networks is literally driving around the states, saying, what do we see here? What churches there'll be some churches that are closing. Some of these places are looking to sell those facilities because they are literally no longer occupied. And so there's a lot of pieces in that conversation that we could look into. It is also probably the flip side of that is, once you find a person, they may say, I feel compelled to go to this spot here.
Right.
Because the church planter is also going to have a heart and a vision for potentially a location. And so they've been praying about it. And so it's almost like the network and the planter begin to dream, hey, what does this look like? And obviously God's involved in this one. I think the South Life story is an amazing one about how God brought together all those pieces, the church, the planter, the location.
Yeah, definitely. We have to dive into that story another time. And I'm a little biased because I work at Ridgepoint, but so yeah, Ridgepoint, our church is currently planning in South Wichita, and it really is a pretty amazing story. So maybe we'll put a pin in that. We'll dive into that story maybe at another time. But Brian, man, the work you're doing is just so important. I'm glad we have your position, and you seem like a great fit for someone to really lead this charge. So thanks for putting these little communities together. Again, great things are going to come out of this. I'm excited for you and for us as a USMB family. So as we wrap up real quick, we've mentioned your newsletter a couple of times. You want to let people know how they can sign up for that and kind of any closing thoughts as we wrap up here?
Yeah. So if you go to the USMB website, right at the top, there's a newsletters, and then you click on that and it'll show you the field and you can subscribe to, it comes out about once a month, and it shares information on where we're up to and how you can be involved. And I would say that one of the ways that anybody listening to this can be involved, I set a goal for 2023 to find 1,000 prayer partners. That's people who would, at minimum, join the field subscription and be able to hear what's going on and then spend some time praying for this harvest. That's why it's called the field, because the field is plentiful. The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few.
Right.
And so I'm asking for God to give us 1,000 people to pray for that work. Pray for the networks, pray for the churches, and pray for 50 Antioch type of churches that are going to say, we're going to take this on. Praying for those Timothys that are saying, I'm ready to take that call. So that's really what I would ask for us to partner together, praying that God would open up some doors.
Yeah, that's good. Awesome, Brian. Well, thanks again. I know this is hard work, and it's, again, you've been at it, 6 months, I guess, but I know it's still new, so there's still a lot to figure out, but I'm just grateful for your heart, for your experience, your leadership. Great things are going to come out of this. So thanks for all your hard work. We're grateful for you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Brian, thanks again for all your great work that you're doing with church planting across the country, and thanks to you for listening today. One of my main takeaways, again, especially if you live in areas like I do, like in Kansas, where it kind of feels like it's a pretty churched, pretty Christian area, some of those stats that Brian shared really were just kind of mind-blowing, that there's still definitely a need for more churches, more pastors, more church leaders, more Christians to just be good examples of Jesus day to day in their lives and their communities. I think we all have a big part to play in that. And so that was just a good reminder for me. So Brian, thanks again for sharing that with us. And so like Brian said there at the end, if you would like to keep up to date with Brian, is the latest news on USMB church planting. You can sign up for that newsletter on usmb.org. You can find the sign up for the field right there. So I encourage you to do that. And continue to be thinking and praying about how you specifically in your church might be able to help out with some of these great projects that are going on. Okay, well, once again, thanks so much for listening. Hope you have a great rest of your week, and look forward to seeing you next time right here on the Lead Pods.
Thanks for listening to Lead Pods. Make sure you don't miss an episode by subscribing to our show wherever you're listening today. Learn more by visiting usmb.org. And be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We'll see you next time as we learn more practical tools to increase our impact together.